Why don't we get started? Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the James Beard Foundation, thank you for joining us. I'm Anna Magnuson, Manager of Industry Support here at JBF. We are very excited for the second of 5 sessions of our Winter Wellness series, Food as Fuel, Eating for Wellness. From the mental to physical, this series aims to combat the various forms of industry burnout and prioritize your well-being. Today, we will be covering Eating for Wellness with our host, Chef Elena Terry, who is also a Chef Bootcamp for Policy and Change and Legacy Network alum. Elena is the executive chef and founder of Wild Bearies, a community-based nonprofit and educational outreach organization. As a seed-to-table chef, Elena develops relationships with tribal community growers and producers. After being inspired by Indigenous food sovereignty work and movement, she built strong partnerships with the American Indian Foods Program and the Intertribal Agriculture Council. She works throughout the Americas advocating on behalf of sustainable cultivation practices and responsible foraging. Elena also works with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the Smithsonian, and the University of Wisconsin on building cultural food history and advocacy for truth and reconciliation. She developed the International Indigenous Culinary Mentorship Program for the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance and continues to advocate for equity and inclusion of Indigenous chefs. Before I pass it over to Elena to begin this session, I want to quickly go over the format of the webinar. So this session is being recorded and will be uploaded to JBF's virtual education library in the coming days. We will try to leave 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end of the session. So please use the Q&A box throughout the webinar and we will get to those at the end. If you're having any tech issues, please put it in the chat and we will do our best to assist you. Great. So why don't we pass it off here to Elena to get started. Thank you so much, Elena, for being here.
Hello, good morning. Hi, Nipi, hi, Nikaragiwi. My name is Elena Terry, and I am a chef and founder of a nonprofit called Wild Bearies, which really works to bring people back to community who are suffering or overcoming alcohol and other drug abuse issues or emotional traumas. And we do that by using our traditional and ancestral food as a vessel to bring back. You know, there's such healing and celebration. Food cares for us in certain ways. And so by being able to tap into the cultural significance and really the traditional teachings that we have about our foods has allowed me to create a space for healing in my community. So when I was approached by the Beard Foundation to help with this incredible series, I was thinking about the question asked of us, which is how can we do better in caring for ourselves? How can we better care for ourselves in this industry, which is very physically taxing, which is mentally taxing, and sometimes very isolating and secluded feeling. You know, like you live in this space of your restaurant or your kitchen area, and sometimes it's hard to breach and to make a stronger community and a network of support with peers who understand what that struggle truly is. So I thought, how could I incorporate some of the work that I do in a way that you could truly understand what this journey of better caring for myself was, and hopefully find ways and places where you can relate to those stories and maybe incorporate it into your own daily routines. So in order to truly understand what the food is medicine statement, food is medicine, right? Sometimes it's a catchphrase, sometimes it's a very literal meaning. For me, it's my life. The medicine is the way that the networks of purveyors, growers, ranchers, the communities that we feed, the cultural significance and the traditional values that go along, the traditional ecological knowledge that's passed down, all of that is part of the medicine that happens in a kitchen for me. And I'm so grateful for it because for me personally, I had reached this point in my career in corporate restaurants where it was always on the go, you know, 70-hour weeks. And it was really difficult for me to leave that space and go to ceremonies. I'm a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation, and that's one of the reasons why I operate out of rural Wisconsin, because this is our ancestral homelands, and it's really important for me to continue bringing awareness to the history of this space. So doing my work here is not only educating, but it's incredibly rewarding, because the more space that we're able to reclaim as Indigenous peoples, the better chance for the next generations to continue being able to have the same resources we have today. So looking at food and these kitchen spaces and not trying to feel like it's a chore to go to work, or I know that I'm going to be going to work for 12, maybe 17 hours today. How can I make sure that I'm caring for myself in the day, that I'm feeding myself, that I'm replenishing the energy that I'm putting into this job, and that I'm appreciating the reason why I'm doing this? Like, I love to cook, and for me, it's very healing. So I'd like you all, just for 1 second, to close your eyes and think of one of your favorite meals ever. Bring yourself back to that space where you were enjoying a meal. Who was at the table with you? What did it smell like? How did the food feel when you ate it? And how did you feel when you left that space? It's the beauty of food, right? It's the beauty of being able to create sensical memories that can be implanted in your blood, that can transport you to different spaces or places, that can bring back people to your life that might have moved on or left this earth. It's being able to elicit that comfort. Food shows up for us in spaces of mourning, in celebration, families, holidays. So how do we honor that a little bit more? And in honoring that beauty of food, we're ultimately caring for ourselves better, right? So from where I'm at in Wisconsin, and I think that in order to really understand the medicine and the healing and the beauty of food, you kind of have to look at the history of it and recognize that, although my story is one of an Indigenous person, a Native American, every culture has these food histories and these stories. And unfortunately, a lot of times in history, food was used as a weapon. And those moments in history where that food, something that's supposed to nourish you and replenish you and fuel you, was used as a weapon against you, those are things that cause what we refer to as like intergenerational traumas. Even nowadays, food is used as a weapon with advertising and not being able to access it the same way that we should be able to. We should be able to eat the way we want to eat, and it's not possible for a great deal of our population. So when we're out there feeding people, how do we make those meals memorable? How do we make sure that they leave feeling truly nourished and not just fed? That we are creating experiences not only for them, but for us as well. So it's kind of shifting what might have historically been something used to manipulate whole communities or populations of people, and turning that into something that is beautiful and a reclamation. And so I wanted to share a little story with everyone about how it affected me in my life, and recognizing that as a single mother working in the industry, I was working a lot, minimum 50 hours a week, and that was on a good week. And we're not rolling in the dough, unfortunately. It's not like always a case where you're going to be in the clear at the end of a service with resources being what they are in our industry. So it's, for me, it was taking a moment to see, how can I step away from the hustle of it and really truly enjoy the work that I was doing. I would have to leave. I would like go to work at this corporate restaurant and leave at the end of closing on a Saturday night and drive an hour and a half to go to ceremonies, which was what my spirit needed to be able to just even continue on with life. And then I would be at ceremonies and have to leave them early to go back and close the restaurant again. And it was such a pull for me to be able to have to leave a space that I really truly felt cared for and go back to a space that I really enjoyed being at, but it wasn't rewarding me the way that I needed it to. It was more like, okay, I know what I need to do here. And it was very routine. And although I absolutely loved the speed and the energy of a Saturday night, it was having to quickly shift and live in these two different worlds. And I know um, for me, it was going to ceremonies and these religious places, but it could be anything that you have to walk away from, your job site to go to, and having to shift from that very fast pace to, okay, now I'm going to the soccer game and I'm going to sit and watch, my child play soccer or something. It's being able to manage those spaces in a way where you're not completely depleted from it. And so getting the nourishment that you need from, your kitchen family or your purveyors or your growers. So for me, it was making this decision that I couldn't exist in a corporate restaurant and be able to maintain my mental health or be able to participate truly in spiritual ceremonies without having to compartmentalize my life and exist in these different areas. And the wild berries kind of came from that because I was a person that needed to help healing, help in healing from emotional traumas. There's these things that we're taught not to talk about in our communities, and unfortunately in my community a lot of that stems around substance abuse. So I thought, how could I use this thing that I loved, food, being around it, creating something beautiful, these memories from my job, how could I do that and still be able to honor what I needed from my spirit, which was to be able to be Ho-Chunk and to be able to remember and reclaim these things that were coming back to us in abundance. So I wanted to share with you a little bit of these foods behind me. This is my closet that I keep our seeds in because uh, as we started to transition to this space of really being able to recognize what healing was for us in our community, our foods started showing up in ways that we had never had them before. And so um, we quickly were able to clear out a closet space and start a pantry of seeds and preserved foods, and really starting to learn more about how deeply connected we were, not just as Ho-Chunks, but as Indigenous people throughout the Americas, by our foods, and how these foods have continued to kind of come along with us and carry us and care for us when we needed them the most. So as a Ho-Chunk woman, our tribe was very abundantly populated in the state of Wisconsin primarily. We were forcibly removed from the state of Wisconsin. They said confirmed 11 times, but our verbal history says up to 15 times. And during those removals, we had to take the seeds that we could, and our ancestors sewed them into their moccasins or into their clothing or hid them so that they had them, knowing that if we had these traditional foods, we would be able to make it home. And we did every time, or I wouldn't be able to say that I'm living in Wisconsin, in our ancestral homelands again. But during these moves, we recognize, and these are some of these ecological teachings, the traditional teachings that we've been able to receive, that our food is alive, that the plants live, the animals, they live. And in doing that, there's energetic and transfers and prayer and all of these other components to putting a meal on a plate. And it was very eye-opening in realizing what true mindfulness is when you eat something, when you actually really nourish yourself. So going back to these removals for us, we looked at these seeds here as relatives of ours, that they were coming with us. If I'm going, you're coming with me, because I know that we'll take care of each other, and we have a better chance of not only returning, but surviving if we do that. And we honored our food that way. So it was a really big wake-up call for me when I had health issues, and all of a sudden I was pre-diabetic, I borderline high blood pressure, I had anxiety and all of these other things that I let go for way too long in my life. And it was not self-care at all. It was, moving in a machine and trying to constantly be productive. And so really stopping and taking a second to grow some seeds into plants that I then canned and started to feed our family, or making partnerships with purveyors that did the work, where I could go and harvest with them and learn about what they were doing, and then also return some of what they were able to produce for me back to them in their communities. And this beautiful network of support started just wrapping itself around me. And it all had to do with the food, and how the food kind of brought this journey and these conversations to the forefront of our community, and most importantly of myself, because I really needed to stop and reevaluate what my work was, what my job was, how I was being affected by all of it. So I decided to leave corporate restaurants and really go into this work, trusting the journey, saying, like, I know that if I am following what my heart says, that I'll be cared for. And that was not without struggle, but it was very rewarding work to do. And the more I did the work, the more I really enjoyed myself and found what literal grounding was, going out into these spaces and feeling the earth, and knowing that this conversation that I'm having with somebody as I leave these seeds that I've cared for and really protected with to grow, what that relationship looks like. And it started inspiring me to look into more of food history, and really how trade routes started in the Americas, or how these relationships, where before we could get into a plane and fly to Mexico, how long those journeys had to have been for us to have these resources like corn, which was not native to this space, but had traveled up here. And then lived in our community with us, this corn, for hundreds of years, and was so honored and respected that it became part of those ceremonies. So it was really looking at a much bigger picture and being much more mindful of how much I was consuming, how much food waste was happening, where I was able to use these very limited resources for the most impact and healing, and being able to really sit down and look at those relationships, or those spaces, or the interactions that we have in those spaces. It became incredibly apparent that the work that we were doing in reclaiming and bringing these foods back to the community was important to so many more people, and others were having this very similar epiphanies when it came to our traditional foods. So this network started growing, and the way we started caring for each other was different, which was beautiful. Because for me, in corporate restaurants, it was always about who could get the raise, who was more important in the kitchen, or whose skill set was a little bit stronger. It was always competitive and very ego driven. But when it became about the food, that energy shifted and it became a little bit more where like I see you and our jobs are so incredibly different that there's no competition. You know, all of us in this movement of indigenous foods and reclamation have our own histories and our own journeys that we're trying to navigate and bring back to our communities. So there isn't a competition that I felt in these other spaces. It became more of how can I support you? And that shift in thinking in a kitchen for me was transformative, because when others started asking me how they could support, I started feeling like I have skills that I can support others in. And there's ways where my knowledge doesn't need to be used as something to put another person below me. It can be used to bring them to where I'm at. And so that sharing of knowledge became part of this reclamation in the food sovereignty or indigenous food movement. And so that was where this mentorship program kind of sparked from. And it really was going back to these traditional teachings that we had of how we learned or how we shared. And it was through like apprenticing, and I'll show you, come and do it with me. So really switching the way that I looked at work, the way that I chose to fuel myself. Now, don't get me wrong, I have to go through drive-throughs a lot and I'm on the road a lot. So I have to pre-plan what I'm going to eat, because I was, the late night gas station stop. I would feed everybody and forget to care for myself along the way. I never would make myself a plate or eat with staff meal. There was always so much going on. So it's really stopping and saying, if I'm not caring for myself correctly, in all of this beautiful work that's happening is not going to matter as much to me, because ultimately I need to care for myself first. And so it was learning a little bit more about food and our ingredients and being more mindful. I didn't just eat when I woke up at noon and then at night. It was that I ate when I was hungry and I fueled myself differently. I found that something like wild rice, true wild rice, that is traditionally harvest, not like a paddy rice that's cultivated and mass harvest, but the wild rice has 9 grams of protein per serving, half a cup serving. And I am serving all these other people wild rice and I never would eat it for myself. So it was like, okay, if this is going to be my work food, then I need to make wild rice at home and have it ready for me to have when I need to be fueled. And it was mindfully caring for myself differently. It was also honoring the food differently. So I wanted to kind of point out a little bit of these ingredients here. 3 of them that I have, and it's the sisters, the corn. This is our Ho-Chunk pure white corn. So this has been with us for hundreds of years and goes to our ceremonies with us. It grows in our community and it's really been cared for. I'm so grateful for being able to have this even in our lives, or have this in our home. It's very connecting to be able to have this seed. The beans, this bean was, let me see, given to us by the Mohawk Nation. And it's like this incredible ancestral bean they've had for hundreds of years. And then our squash. And this actually is Ho-Chunk squash. But during those removals that I had talked about, the only one that really made it back to Wisconsin was the corn. We had lost a squash and our beans. So these 3 sisters, the corn, the squash, and the beans, are like these perfect growing companions. One replenishes the other. They say the corn grows tall and looks out and protects everything. The squash grows on the ground and keeps it cool and moisturized. And then the beans give the soil the nitrogen that the other 2 deplete it, and grows up the corn. you know, they grow perfectly together. And all these other tribes in the state had these three sisters growing together. And we only had corn as ho chunks. And so I thought we had to have had them, right? We had to have had all three of them. I lived down the road from a raised garden bed that confirms ho chunks were cultivators over 1,000 years ago. So I knew we had to have had more than just corn. And we looked and looked, and then this one returned to us, the ho chunk squash, which was like this beautiful green squash. And yes, there's others that grow similar or might be of a similar variety, but this one was cared for by our ancestors, who also, when they planted it, would sing, and there was a whole ceremony about it. And so it's a little bit different when this came back to us. And this was returned to us from a seed saver very randomly, who stopped by one of our growers' houses and was like, hey, I have this squash for you. It's a Winnebago squash. And we had been looking for the seed, and then it came back. And I knew if we had this corn and the squash that there had to have been a bean that went along with it, right? Like we wouldn't have just grown two of them. It wouldn't have made sense. So we started looking for a bean that was ho chunk or was related to our ancestors, or could be proven to have been grown by our ancestors. And we weren't able to find it. We looked all over. We looked at seed banks, at indigenous seed banks, at tribal growers, to see if anybody had anything historically that we could link to Ho Chunk Nation, and we couldn't. Until one day, a package arrived, and in this package was an envelope, and in that envelope was 20 small bean seeds. And it was my friend from Kentucky, who I never knew was a bean steward. He actually is an herbalist. And there's a lot more to the story, but he got the bean in the early 90s from a grower when he was at a powwow in Wisconsin. And he was the only one to have grown it until 2021, when it returned itself to the Ho Chunks. And he mailed it and said, yeah, I was thinking of you. And I thought, oh my gosh, I have this Ho Chunk bean. Maybe she would like it. And it was something that for, 4 or 5 years, we had been searching for this bean. So I like to think that, putting it out into the universe and saying that we're going to continue creating this space, it finally felt that it was safe enough to come home, because that bean had endured through the removals. And then when it did come back to Wisconsin with the Ho Chunks, there was only one person who had grown it, and he was the one who gave it to my friend. So there was this beautiful flow of how this food had returned to us. And to think, there's a lot of talk about slow food, which is so beautiful. And I think more focus needs to be put on it. But slow food can't even begin to describe like these hundreds of years for food to return to you, and then it shows up. And that feeling when I opened that package and realized what it was, this bean that I had been looking for, it was all the reassurance that I needed to say that in continuing to do this work that I had been drawn to, we would be cared for. Like, there are undeniable nutritional properties to our food that we need to look a little bit more specifically at. And I think how we prepare those foods and really celebrate the individuality of each ingredient, or these unique characteristics that they have. I mean, the science of food is incredible. But when you look at food as this, being that had been alive or is living, or, these plants, that it really brings another light into how you prepare meals, or how you prepare them for yourself, and how you select your ingredients, or how you really choose to nourish yourself. Because like I had said before, when we come up with these food memories, they are very specific to the individual, and it could be anything. If it is a friend situation, or if it is a culturally significant situation, it's the beauty of food. And we have like the best job as chefs to be able to show up and see all of these beautiful aspects of our food, and create something that other people will really truly appreciate and leave fulfilled from. So it's being able to take all of these aspects of our work and create and continue to have growth in our industry or in our specific area of expertise, while also caring for ourselves a little bit better. So for me personally, it was going back to seeing that food in my life was used as a weapon, and it was very specific. We were, I grew up in a very large household between several grandparents' homes and a greater community, because that was the way a tribe historically was. We never thought anything about having a house full of people, or really what that strain of feeding all of those people was what we were able to provide. So we were fed federal commodities a lot, and they were not the healthiest of foods. So as a young child, I had to have a lot of processed foods in my life. But I was also incredibly grateful because my grandparents were traditional both my sides. So my great grandparents would hunt, and my other grandparents were gardeners, and they taught me how to can and how to process meat. And it was never because of lack of resources. It was to retain that knowledge transfer and to show us how, so we would never be without, so we would never have to be reliant on these things that they had to be reliant on. And it was like a reclamation of the space. So being able to acquire like 2 acres of a homestead for my great grandpa was a huge thing, because he was now a landowner and he could have his garden there. So it was recognizing that, yeah, maybe I do have the convenience of going to the grocery store and taking something off the shelf, but I needed, for my own personal healing, to be able to take these seeds and grow a garden. Even if it was like, I'm a chef, I'm not the best gardener ever. There's a lot of like, the learning curve is something that we don't really talk about, because you can't just go out and like grow something from a seed. Not everybody can. I was not successful with everything that I've grown. And it's like appreciating that this is something that as it comes back to us, we have to also gain the knowledge of how to use it or how to grow it again in a way that fits today's day and age. So it's, for me, became very healing. And it was really recognizing that food is a medicine. And it might be that you're the grower and that's a medicine for you, or you're the one creating it. Because when it comes to the Wild Berries and this nonprofit for trying to support people who are on a healing journey or are trying to reconnect to something better or stronger or bigger than what we have in our communities, it was being able to know that this corn was something that was eaten by our ancestors. It gave them the strength to get through the traumas of their age, which was the removals, or the ones that had to go to war and returned home to have this food at ceremony, knowing that it would care for their spirit differently. And no culture is exempt from having those foods. Like, we all have that food. It's just that for me, it's, my story is that of an indigenous history, but we all have this greater connection and these people that bring that healing in. Because if anybody has worked in a kitchen where it is really nurturing, whether it's grandma's kitchen or whether it's the restaurant that really inspired you to be a chef, or however that memory comes to you, I'd encourage you to find those moments and to remember what it is that drives you to do this job that is very physically taxing, can be very mentally taxing, and replenish yourself for the work, because it is a beautiful job to have and an incredible space. I also, kind of going back to where what brought me on this journey really was sparked from emotional traumas. I'm not ashamed or shy to say that I had been in an abusive relationship during all of these transitions, and emerging from that and really saying what it takes to mentally overcome that space that I had existed in. The food helped me do that. the food brought me to my kitchen family, which, I mean, kitchen family, I just love the support and the care and the understanding that you get from the people that you work with in those spaces, because there were times when the isolation of our job, my job, was overwhelming, but then being able to have this family that understood what it was to work in a fast-paced kitchen, or what it was to feed a tribe of people at a conference. The energetic exchange that you have with your staff or the others that you work with in that space is very recharging, if it is the right kind of a space. So for the leaders of that kitchen, it is also part of your responsibility to care for yourself well enough that you are supporting that kind of a space. You know, it's a beautiful time for food right now, and this very, stern brigade, not to say that there isn't, function and purpose with some of those uh, theories and ideologies in kitchens, but it doesn't have to be yelling and throwing things and anger that you see sometimes on TV, because I personally have not worked in kitchens like that. Like, I've worked in kitchens where people are willing to share and support and encourage creativity, which is it's the culinary arts, and it's a beautiful art that we have, and that we're able to kind of really create something beautiful that doesn't last, but it could, because in these experiences that you create for others, you are putting in those sensical memories. Maybe you're creating for them that space where they can close their eyes, and it returns them to the meal that you provided for them and the way that it made them feel. Like, all of those energies go into the food that you create. So I would encourage you to, when you feed yourself, remember that, because all of that good energy you could be giving back to yourself, and really truly nourishing yourself, rather than just nutritionally satisfying, or eating because it's time to eat, or not eating because you're incredibly busy. So I can tell you that when I started personally being a little bit more mindful, and that was a small transition. So it was like, okay, in our family, we're going to commit to eating one traditional food a week in our one meal. Like, I think it was, okay, instead of having oatmeal, we're going to have blue corn mush for breakfast, or we're going to add we're going to have cornbread instead of yeasted bread. It was these small transitions, or we're going to add these beans instead of having potatoes, and changing that over the course of 4 or 5 years, all of our eating habits have changed here. And although I'm not exempt from having to go through a drive-through, it is not my go-to choice. I would much rather pack something and bring it along for a road trip than rely on a space where I'm not going to truly enjoy it. And then when I do get to sit down and have that meal, it's a much more enjoyable meal for me personally. And so being a little bit more mindful and caring for myself a little bit more differently, I got out of the danger zones and everything. Like, I'm no longer even pre-diabetic or in any danger zone, and my blood pressure is great, and I can sleep at night, and all of these things. It didn't happen in a moment, but it happened in a lot of moments of lucidity where I saw that I needed to care for myself differently. And although I'm feel a great amount of privilege for being able to have access to some of our traditional foods, like, this is what I have access to at the moment. It's being able to bring those foods back into my life more, and opening myself up to being able to have more of them, that has created the space for them to return. And I think the bean is a good example of that. It's that I had to just believe that if we continued creating this space and caring for our food and for ourselves a little bit differently, that it would feel good enough and strong enough to return to us and grow again. And it did. It did. The bean grew for the first year that we planted it. We didn't know if it was going to be a bush bean or a pole bean, and it grew up the side of my grower's house. She had it in a little garden box because we had a limited amount of seed and kind of needed to keep it protected. But we're not going to have that bean for probably another 10 or 15 years in our communities for others to have access to it. So it's realizing that it's not something that's going to happen overnight, but small changes make great strides in the long run. And so it is recognizing that creating different habits, opening up your mind, and being a little bit more willing to receive some of that, and taking a step away sometimes from the hustle of what our industry sometimes is. I know as a chef, I also like to thrive. I love that space. That's the reason why I work in kitchens, is for the hustle, but it's taking the time away from that and really saying like, okay, I was able to give it my all, and like, what an incredible service. And I feel amazing, but what do I need to do for myself to replenish so that I can do it again tomorrow or next week or down the road? And it's not just thinking about like what the hustle is today. It's thinking about what the long-term effects of this will be, and how do you care for yourself in a way that you can sustain it for the long term. So I wanted to take a minute. I know, Anna, you had said for questions. I haven't even looked because I've just been talking. If there are any questions in the chat, or if anybody has anything, or if you want to see any of the ingredients behind me.
Do we have any questions from the audience? I'll give folks a minute, but I don't know, Elena, if you want to. Oh, I have a hand raised. Tony, you can, if you want to put your question in the chat for us, if you're able. I see. I just wondered what the name of the bean that endured is.
So it is, during these removals that we had, our tribe was separated. So although we have the same ancestral DNA, we are recognized federally as two completely separate nations. So part of our ancestors stayed on the reservation of the Winnebago in Nebraska, and this bean stayed with them. So prior to being returned and being grown by this elder, it had been known as the Omaha and Winnebago bean. And so when it returned to us, it had come in this little envelope, and I immediately recognized that there were Ho-Chunk spaces, like it had said Pachchinunk and Nishla and Nikchangara, and it was all of these Ho-Chunk names of places that this bean had been recorded of being grown by. So it had been recorded as being a Ho-Chunk bean prior to going and staying on the reservation, but it had stayed there and grown until the early 1900s. And then the elder had got it here and was the only one who grew it until 1970, late 70s. And he was a little too old to keep up with his garden until he gave it to that bean steward in 1992. So it was like incredible to also see that this whole history had come and had traveled with the bean. Like it had its own little historical reference with it, which was just incredibly beautiful, because it like reiterated that this bean had a life of its own, and it had also had this incredible journey of its own. Yes, and okay, so I saw in the chat. I can show you some more, a little bit, if you'd like. I do have, like, this right here is the little corn braid, and this is not ancestral, but it is grown by a indigenous grower on a farm around here, and it's strawberry popcorn. So it's something that you can order off of a lot of seed catalogs, but it's a really neat way to, like, I bring it around because you can kind of see how we braid for preservation of the seeds. And at this point, it can be used as popcorn or it can be used as seed. So it's kind of a beautiful little thing here, which is incredible. It's delicious. And it does have a red hull when you pop it, which not all of them have the same color when they pop it. I had shown you the ho-chunk corn, which is this tiny little white corn here. This is the Oneida white corn, which is one of their ancestral corns, and it's a much larger kernel. And somebody was asking me about our corn just yesterday, and I said, I think that it must have traveled somewhat similarly to these spaces historically, because the characteristics are very similar when you process it, except ho-chunk corn's hull is a little bit smaller and softer to process. So it's kind of neat to think that maybe there genetically some historical similarities from these trade routes, but because of the regions that they grew in and the natural selection, that the Oneida white corn was a larger kernel and was a little bit harder of a hull than the ho-chunk ended up being. And I also have this one right here, which is Teosinte, and it's the beginning of corn. So this is like the wild corn that they originally started separating into seeds. So they would it was hand selection after harvest, and then they would like the following year plant the largest selected kernels out of that. And it was like hundreds of years of this selection that they ended up going from this very small, almost tiny grain-like to being the kernels of corn that we know nowadays. So it's really neat to even have this because it's like the beginning and it's the old corn, and just to have like this great ancestor here with us too. It was a really appreciated gift when it was given to us. And let me see, some of our food here, like this is some salmon that we got canned from Alaska. And it was one of those things where we were able to trade some of our stuff and they traded us some of their resources. It's like incredible that they traditionally canned it, and it's in its own oil. So it's really neat. And I'll show you one more. This is a bean, and this is called Paint It Like a Horse. So I have a partnership with Sakari Farms on the West Coast. They're right around Bend, Oregon. And her name is Spring, and Spring had suffered when you're in agriculture, it's not a matter of if it's going to happen, it's when the environment is going to kind of shift your growing season and how significantly it will affect you. So for Spring, I remember seeing Facebook Live of a hailstorm coming, and that hail was like, the size of a baseball, and it was just hitting and rolling down all of her fresh crops. And she was crying, like, I just got all of these in, my seedlings were in, and then we got this freak storm. And she had reached out to the community, and they planted all of the extra seedlings she had in her greenhouse. And a second hailstorm hit, and the same thing took out her truck, took out all of the crops. And she was like, I don't even know what I'm going to do because I don't have the seed now. I have it just enough for this year's growing, and hopefully nothing else will happen. And then the wildfires hit. So this was in 2020, the fall of 2020. And she was like, all of my plants are getting choked. I think I'm devastated. I don't know if I'm going to be able to continue on. And I was talking to my friend who was a grower from Michigan, and I said, Spring needs help. I think maybe we should try and get some of these seeds to her so she has enough at least to care for her. So Rosebud and I took off on a cross-country trip and stopped at all of these tribal farms and growing spaces where we knew that they had seeds, and told them about Spring. And from Michigan to Bend, Oregon, we were able to pick up an entire suitcase of seeds that people were willing to give her so that she wouldn't be devastated from these environmental factors. And one of the seeds that we got was this Paint It Like a Horse bean. We got this from the United Tribes Technical College, and they gave us 4 bean pods, and then they gave us some bean pods to take to spring. And so it was pretty incredible to be able to have that much support, and really people being able saying like, these are our relatives and we know what the struggle is, so we're going to share. We had like 2 giant squash in the back seat of the car and this whole suitcase full of seeds, but being able to support in this way and to say like, if you do your work, I can do my work a little bit better, so how can I continue to support you in that? Um, she has Sakari Farms now, and it is doing really well and expanding. She just built a commercial kitchen, and I think we might even have a little gift going out from Sakari Farms. But it's incredible the way this network is and the way these relatives come. So this bean always means a lot to me. It reminds me of why we do the work that we do and how it came to me, and where I was at that moment when like the bean was given to us, and why we were on that journey. So like I said, almost everything in my cupboard has a story like that. Not sure if there's any other questions. I'm trying to see like these things that they have.
Yeah, I was just checking the chat as well. I guess I know we have a few minutes. So before we close out, I guess if there's anything, Elena, in terms of a couple of takeaways that you think are maybe most important to speak to, for folks leaving the webinar.
Yeah. Like I said, I wanted you to understand what my journey was, and I'm okay with sharing it because for me, it is a very beautiful journey. Every time I've stumbled and gotten up, it's been like a win. And so I'm okay with sharing it. But everybody has their journey, and everybody has their story and their lessons and their connections. Whether it's your local community, your patrons, your kitchen staff, it it's those connections, the energy, and the exchanges that we get for me that make this job so incredibly unique and beautiful. Like our community, the way we truly care for each other when we do it in our restaurants or our kitchens and our spaces of work, it is an incredibly nourishing and beautiful community without a lot of judgment and with a lot of support when you know where to look. So please remember to care for yourself, and to know that, stumbling or life lessons, all of those things happen. That's what life is, right? It's that being able to get up and learn those lessons and take away something bigger that makes it incredibly rewarding. And so I'm always grateful for my kitchen and my industry family, because they remind me of why I truly love my job and the work that I do. So always grateful as well to be part of the Beard Foundation and to receive the support. I mean, I know Anna had mentioned it at the beginning, but I have been a participant in several of the programs, and so incredibly transformative to be able to be seen and supported in such ways that, we haven't always been, not only as a female, but as like a female Indigenous chef, to be able to have and to be celebrated in these spaces. Um, it is very healing for me as well. So I'm always grateful for my industry family and for those who are willing to hear my story. So thank you all for coming in and being a part of it. And I hope that the takeaway and what you can do for yourself today is to maybe really sit for a moment and remember what food is to you and how it has shown up in your life, or how it continues to care for you, and how you will care for yourself a little bit better with food. So thank you all. I'll just say it in Ho-Chunk, wa iniganamshina naga pinagijiwino. So thank you all for your attention and for participating.
Thank you so much, Elena. This was super informative and just so wonderful. We really appreciate your time. We know how busy you are, and thank you for everyone who attended. Again, this is our second webinar of our 5-part series, so be sure to join us next week. As you can see up here, and I put it in the chat, The recording of this webinar will be in our virtual education library for anyone who has missed it. And here is some info where you can see all the work that Elena is doing that she's mentioned on wildberries.org. And there is also her Instagram. We will be back next Monday at 1 p.m. with Adrian Lipscomb to go over herbalism. So super excited for that. Thank you so much again, Elena. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you next week.